on to session 9, Africa's Energy Options, Debates on Fuels and Technologies. This should be a fun one. So as you can see from the description, we explore some of the key low carbon technologies that have been identified by many African countries as forming the backbone of a future energy system. Now, we know that there are a lot of debate and some of it not comfortable about the various energy options that Africa has. It's a highly political and somewhat polarized discussion. We're going to try to unpack that here. But one of the approaches I think we've been encouraging in the framing document is there are no easy choices. Dr. Ali from Kitawu, Kenya, will be joining us in a moment. And we have Brian Kamanzi. I think we're going to open this session with a presentation from Brian. Brian has got quite a detailed presentation on the issues. So I'm going to look, and I've asked Brian if we can circulate his presentation to the group, because there's a lot of dense and important content in that presentation. So Brian's joining us from New York. If it's okay, I'm going to vacate the stage.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks, it's great to present again. This morning we're going to be going through quite a bit of material, but this is building from the presentation that we had in Nairobi last year that was looking at some of the techno-economic issues that was mainly focusing on wind and solar, but there was a sense or request that we can look at a broader array of some of the low carbon technologies for electrifying Africa. It's still a work in progress, but we're getting there. Next slide. Okay, so just a quick reminder and a setting of the scene. You know, electrification in Africa began in the colonial period, and it really had a few main functions. One of them was that there was limited industrial application. It started off with commercial lighting, particularly in railways, early telecommunications. We're thinking of the telegraph. It moved to mechanization of mining that was dominated in Southern Africa. So the demand for electricity came in to support the mechanization of mining, and pumped water for irrigation, and limited reticulation through small decentralized grids. What does that mean? Microgrids and decentralized infrastructure are not quite new and have had well-known rural applications for decades, and have been also used to support Western military bases in Africa, supplying remote areas, and have had increasing adoption in mines. So towards building a new national program, after the colonial period formally ended, electrification in Africa became characterized by a few things. National electrification schemes, so rural electrification, most importantly, was seen as a key nation-building activity, as we discussed on day one, that had very checkered success. Electricity has increasingly became a central aspect of living a decent life and became integrated into the demands for basic services for new independent governments, made to new independent governments from the people. African states aiming to rapidly industrialize began to embark on large-scale projects. Some of the key ones: Akosombo Dam in Ghana, Aswan Dam in Egypt, the Grand Inga 1 and Inga 2 being developed from as early as the 1980s, all big hydro dams. The IMF and the World Bank played a key role in financing those, and many issues followed with the conditions that were imposed tied to those loans, which became what we've discussed quite at length, both in this session and in the preparatory meetings. This is structural adjustment period. State-owned energy utilities became to be seen as a vehicle for facilitating socioeconomic development, with a larger mandate than simply the delivery of electricity. Since the structural adjustment period, as a result of the neoliberal policies that have been imposed, we've seen an underinvestment in maintenance in distribution and generation systems, leading to low levels of efficiency and high losses with existing infrastructure, and a lack of expansion of the transmission grid. Stagnating process on expansion of access to electricity, particularly in rural areas. In some countries, it has actually reversed over the last 10 years. That's more so due to conflict. Demand is dominated by urban consumption due to low levels of industrialization and lack of progress with rural electrification. And the neoliberal, that neoliberal macroeconomic framework has turned basic service delivery demands that came in the early in the early moment of building newly independent states into rent-seeking opportunities for multinationals, and the delivery of electricity has become dominated by companies that are selling financial services. Next slide. So the transition and distribution network, I've put up this map. We think of the transmission distribution networks as the highways, the transport infrastructure of the electrical system. It is characterized by a few things. This is to recap. We have, again, low levels of industrial demand, so it's heavily residential. You'll find that the distribution infrastructure is mainly focused on connections to individual people's houses. There's low level of investment. So if you go on to the next slide, you will see some of the impact of that. The latest data I could find was only from 2014, from the countries listed in the graph, but you have high levels of losses. And what this means is that even with the low levels of electrical energy present, we're losing energy through the inefficiency of the transport infrastructure. The average is about 20% for the countries listed here in 2014. In some cases, it's reports are that losses have actually increased over the last 10 years, partly because of continued lack of maintenance. So you can expect that number to slightly increase. The World Bank estimates and the IFC estimate that this has resulted in $5 billion in annual losses, and is about 10% over the global average for transmission distribution losses. So what sort of improvements do we expect to see, and are actually relatively low-hanging fruit? A lot of the key infrastructure upgrades are not necessarily high technology and really involve the replacing of aging infrastructure, cables, transformer, protection devices, many of which have been available and in use for decades. Also investing in upskilling and expanding of existing workforces, particularly in the distribution layer. What are some of the benefits of focusing on fixing what you have in terms of transport infrastructure? Is really maximizing the potential for quality employment. Most distribution companies across the African continent are public. Localization of industries. So in some countries are in a better position to take on high technology aspects like transformer design and manufacturing. We have some transformer designers in Africa. Copper armature winding, which is labor intensive and is done in several countries which have copper mining already taking place, but copper armature winding for transformers that will actually be used in your country or used on the continent. Cabling as well, manufacturing of cabling, and of course, improving the efficiency of existing infrastructure. Why is that relevant? Well, if you can improve if your efficiency, if your transmission losses are sitting at 20%, if you can improve them by half, you may cut out the need for building out new generation capacity in a short period to meet supply gaps in the short term. Next slide. If we're talking about expanding universal access in Africa, we're really, rural electrification is front and center. But when we're providing rural access, we have to appreciate that there's a quantitative and qualitative dimension to access. So that may look different for different countries, and we have to, I think, move towards finding common definitions for energy poverty that have implications for scale. An example of what we might mean by quantitative, a minimum quantum of energy that's used per person or per household over a period of time. In South Africa, free basic electricity is conceived of through legislation as being 50 kilowatt hours per month. Civil society organizations and the trade union movement think that that's too low, but that's an example of a quantitative dimension of access. A qualitative aspect is the degree to which that connection is reliable, stable, so that you have electricity when you need it, but also that the quality of the connection and the power that's produced is such that it doesn't damage the lighting and consumer electronics you have in your house. Rural electrification is mainly driven to meet national targets and obligations. It's often thought of in a rights discourse. And the efforts are often to substitute the use of burning fuels like paraffin and biomass, often wood and other forms of agricultural waste, for cooking and lighting, and also to facilitate economic development in rural areas. Sometimes agro-processing, but perhaps not nearly enough. There are three main ways of achieving that. You have standalone home systems. Those are mainly PV. So that's having a PV and a battery system installed on somebody's house or in a group of people's houses, a very small group, standalone home systems that's not connected to a grid. Microgrids, they are miniature versions of what the national grid infrastructure looks like. So it might be the connection of an entire village to a small network. That could be run in theory by any energy source, but at the moment they're mainly PV and diesel based, with some battery storage in a growing number of those, including battery storage. Microgrids can also, in theory, be connected to a national grid, but they need to be, when you design a microgrid, you have to have that in mind. Grid extension, that means expanding the distribution network by extending a physical connection from the national grid to a rural area, and providing access through the transport infrastructure, extending the transport infrastructure. Next slide. The World Bank has quite an extensive program. Comrades may be aware of it, but if you're not, have a look, just Google it and you can see some of these maps and you see what they have planned out for your country. The World Bank Global Electrification Program models the scenarios of what is required to meet the 2030 universal access tasks. You can call this perhaps the private pathway. I've taken here, we've got a quick snapshot of what they're looking at for Uganda. So by 2030, to achieve universal access, they're looking at the need for raising $10 billion of investment. The plan would see about 2.7 gigawatts of capacity installed, almost all of that coming from PV and PV hybrid, implicitly meaning use of gas and also storage. Grid extension, of that 2.7, grid extension would be the majority of that, 1.8 gigawatts, standalone home solar, so solar kits that are rolled out and given to individual households in rural areas, and PV-based microgrids that's usually at community scale, or perhaps for clinics and small businesses. For just to give a sense, electrical energy consumption in Uganda is particularly low. It's about 95 kilowatt hours per year per capita, currently with about 1.5 gigawatts installed. So they're looking at doubling that by 2030 through the use mainly really of these small standalone solar systems, microgrids, and some grid extension. So we can see that there's clearly a qualitative aspect here, and energy consumption matters. You can achieve universal access in any number of ways, but that may not actually be referring to what we mean and what we're anticipating for. Comrade Trevor had mentioned electricity as a facilitator for socioeconomic development. If we're simply talking about access, we may be missing the point unless we're more explicit about the benefits that we expect to reach in the complementary transformations in our policies. Next slide. Here's a very quick case of a company called Mobisol. It was a Berlin-based company that aimed to provide rural Africans with electricity. They implemented many pioneering models. They had rent-to-own systems like $2 a day leases for standalone solar kits that were put on villages' individual homes, and then pay-go systems for microgrids. That's pay as you go or prepaid systems that were essentially running private microgrids. Mobisol pitched to African governments that it could build this electrical infrastructure cheaper and faster than the government, and that it should attract state support and incentives to achieve access targets. Rural electrification very rarely happens at any scale without incentives. In fact, I'm yet to find a case where that's the case. Mobisol was able to raise from Europe in the order of, at its height, the company's collapsed now, it was taken over by, I think, an Italian utility. It raised 100 million euros in debt and 25 million euros in equity from largely European creditors and investors, and it has claimed to electrify 1 million people. The microgrids were controlled through digital infrastructure from Europe, and low-cost technicians, essentially underpaid technicians, who were hired in host countries and became integrated into the project over time. The small utilities, so these microgrids would act as small utilities in villages, would often create small microfinance services to provide loans to villages so they could have take-up of appliances, because a bigger demand for electricity creates a better business case for electrification. The microgrids for Mobisol, as is typical across the continent where they are used, are PV battery and diesel-based, and diesel presents affordability challenges, especially when prices fluctuate. Next slide. So some comments, we could have a session on its own for that, but small-scale microgrids have clear application for a variety of rural contexts and some technology-wise, especially where grid access is low and of a low priority. Microgrids are typically dependent on subsidies. If we look at India, which has a tremendous sample of the different variety of both publicly and privately owned microgrids, we can see that there are positive impacts for publicly operated and maintained microgrids at a village level, at district level. PV module assembly factories are highly modular. So we know that Africa has a high amount of PV resources available, and you can have PV factories that produce, small factories that produce 50 megawatts a year of panels, up to large ones that are 500 megawatts per year that already exist in the African continent. There's no reason why it cannot be located across many other different countries. So PV, heavy rural electrification schemes that are reliant on public subsidies, even in the poorest countries, should be candidates for establishing module manufacturing coordination with international OEM. Should be looking at that. The use of microhydro and small-scale biomass plants, where applicable, has been used to substitute the use of diesel, because we know the sun doesn't shine all the time. You need other complementary resources. So small microhydro where it's available, and small-scale biomass plants are often used. These technologies are well established and been used in Africa for over 60 years. And the potential for local technology absorption and innovation in technical institutions and universities is high. Next slide. So I'm not going to read that. There's a quote there. You'll have access to the slide. There's a concept around appropriate technology. I hope that we can consider, I'll be advocating for us to have time to discuss the concept of appropriate technology when we discuss rural electrification. But very relevant for our discussion is that we need to move the discussion about rural electrification to also talking about electricity for productive use, and noting that setting the ambition for rural electrification is very important. Providing basic access for thinking about lighting and cooking, versus creating the infrastructure that's capable of actually supporting agri-industrial activities, raising incomes, electrifying hospitals, reticulation of water in villages, for productive use and for household use has very substantially different technical and economic implications. India's experience with rural electrification, which heavily uses microgrids, actually demonstrates that rural agricultural production doesn't necessarily, and incomes don't necessarily increase by simply having access to electricity. Scale and the quantitative and qualitative aspects matter. Subsidy and support programs for complementary technologies like solar pumps, water pumps, they don't have to be solar, water pumps in general, agri-processing machinery and skills development that supports the use of these technologies are also important to have alongside your electrification scheme, rural electrification scheme. Next slide. Sorry, Landa, there's the ordering issue there. Yeah, that's correct. Okay. Low carbon technology, we're going to go very quickly into the different types of technologies that are described as being low carbon. Here, I am really not advocating and saying that we must use any one of these particular technologies. These technologies are regarded as low carbon technologies in Africa by the governments and included in their integrated resource plans and energy resource plans accordingly. At the moment, if we're just looking at power plants that are installed, this map that you have, this heat map shows that the scale and the different types of power plants that are installed across the continent. Hydropower, fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and solar PV are the most widely adopted technologies. North Africa is highly dependent for gas. We saw on the first day, North Africa has a very high access rates. They achieve that mainly with gas. Central and East Africa has a high adoption of hydro resources due to what's available, and coal dominates Southern Africa, although South Africa skews the statistics for that. Large-scale concentrated solar is located in South Africa and North Africa at present, although there's, as we discussed with how the standalone systems are being used, they're being deployed throughout, but the scale is relatively small. Access to water is critical for nuclear, oil, and coal-based plants, especially for cooling. So, access to water resources isn't strictly about hydro resources. It's linked to a number of key technologies that are currently in use. There are several notable high-capacity plants that are located on the African continent, mainly coal and hydro, which are performing well below their technical capability. I think of Grand Inga, which I think is, less than 30% of its rated capacity. It's currently delivering. Think of large coal plants in South Africa like Kusile and Medupe, which have design defects, which are most of the time not operational at all at this stage. But across the continent, some of those big scale projects, especially from the structural adjustment period, have cited lack of maintenance and decades, in some cases for the hydro, decades of underinvestment, lack of resources committed to that, and skills shortages in the utility have resulted in low performance from these generators. Next slide. So the ordering is not right. There we go. Yes, thank you. Here's a map of the hydro resources. You'll have access to the map. You can have a look at that. Akosombo and Aswan Dam, Ghana and Egypt, were two early post-independence projects that were supported by the World Bank. At that time, large hydro was all the rage in the World Bank, and countries like Brazil and India had very large projects also commissioned. In more recent times, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, rated at 6 gigawatts, is now reaching completion after 11 years. It's unfortunately mired with geopolitical tension, particularly with Egypt and Sudan, raising concerns around its impacts on the Nile River downstream, impacting communities' livelihoods and potentially the Aswan Dam's productivity. Some of that is contested by Ethiopia, but we'll see how that plays out. The dam in Ethiopia was financed by the Chinese Development Bank. Next slide. Partially financed by the Chinese Development Bank. So the number of advantages and disadvantages I'm going to show for some of the technologies are not a illustration of which is better and which is worse. So I'll just say that, but there are tremendous benefits to hydropower if you have access to it. It's of course very low carbon in profile. It's a well-established technology that's been used in Africa for over 100 years of various scales. The plants typically remain economical for very long lifespans, and hydro plants are well suited for load following. And what that simply means, they may be well suited to pair well with wind and solar technologies, which we know have been widely recommended to be used in decarbonizing electricity grids. There are many problems. I won't go into all of them, but large hydro dams in particular are very high capital intensive and are tied to a legacy of incurring high debt burdens in Africa. There are various environmental and technical risks associated with rupture and damage of dams. Construction of dams alters local ecosystems, impacting river flows, which not only has environmental implications, it may have cultural implications as well, and implications around how people are displaced, and so on. Electrical generation output from hydro dams is vulnerable to the occurrence of droughts. Actually, some of the expansion of IPPs in Zambia was tied to supply shortages in its hydroelectric capacity. It was compromised by a severe drought. So it does have that vulnerability. Next slide.
Hey, Brian, can you slow down a little?
I can,
for the interpreters. Thank you.
Nuclear technology, highly controversial technology. However, it is one that it is not well acknowledged, perhaps in some of the discussions, that it actually features fairly prominently as one of the low carbon options that a number of African countries are looking at. By 2018, Africa had as many as 10 research nuclear reactors installed across the African continent. These are not commercial, these are research reactors located in Algeria, DRC, Egypt, Ghana, Libya, Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa. Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Morocco, Niger, Nigeria, and Sudan are currently in the process with the International Atomic Energy Agency to assess the readiness and to begin developing nuclear programs for themselves. I put a map here for you to look at if there's interest that shows essentially the IAEA, that's the International Industry Body for nuclear, developed a milestone approach to benchmark a country's readiness for nuclear. It essentially starts from the point where a country announces that they want to embark on a nuclear program, all the way to the commissioning and eventually the decommissioning of a plant, milestone 1 to 3. Only one plant in Africa has gone up to milestone 3. Koeberg, which has 2 units in South Africa in Cape Town. Egypt is said to be the next in line. They have achieved milestone 2 in their nuclear program with a plant by the name of El Dabar. It will consist of 4 nuclear reactors, cumulatively adding 4.8 gigawatts of capacity. So that'll be almost 5 times the size of South Africa's nuclear capacity. The plant is being designed to have a lifespan of 60 years, investment cost of $30 billion, $5 billion of which they aim to raise from private investors, and it will be financed by, it will also be financed by Russia, and they are citing in the media that at an interest rate of 3%. South Africa is currently in the process its nuclear plants, extending them from 40 to 60 years, which will see them running through the critical period of decarbonization. Algeria, Tunisia, Uganda, and Zambia are also in active policy debates to include nuclear power in their future energy mixes. Next slide. I won't go into all of these, you'll have access to them. Nuclear power is thought of as being a 100-year investment, in the sense of it takes quite a long time to go through the process of establishing the appropriate regulatory rules, legislative environment, but also the plants, if they are constructed and built well, can last for a very long time. So it's thought of as a 100-year enterprise, and that, of course, we have to think carefully about the fact that decommission must be executed appropriately, because that has significant implications. The radiation may have significant implications for our populations. So we have to really think about the full life cycle of a nuclear plant. Nuclear plants are well suited to provide baseload power with very low emissions profiles. They have the technical capability of operating at high reliability levels with high capacity factors over a long period of time. South Africa has already proven that in terms of the African continent. Nuclear power stations are highly energy dense, which means they don't use much land to produce a high amount of output. Newer technologies are pitched as being smaller and faster to build, which responds to some of the issues that has been seen in the nuclear industry, where it's not only very high cost, but plants are associated all over the world with very high overruns and delays. So if you're looking for a quick fix, nuclear solution may not be at the top of your priorities. But the development of small modular reactors is also a response to the changing financing environment. And so the need for the advent of capacity markets in Europe and North America, and the need for small scale dispatchable plants to pair with wind and solar has led to the rise of this new technology, small modular reactors. The industry is pitching that this might actually have some potential benefits in Africa, where we have small capacity in our distribution and transmission networks. So in many countries, having a large-scale nuclear reactor simply won't work, because you don't have the demand to justify such an investment. A small modular reactor in the order of tens to hundreds of megawatts may be suitable, but it may be high cost. So I think that organizations and countries that are looking for that need to go and undergo the appropriate feasibility assessments. There are issues around the storage of reactive waste, and those also need to be included within feasibility studies, and it's related to potential wartime use. Actually, most countries in Africa are signatories on exclusive civilian use of treaties for civilian use of nuclear energy. So I think it's an open debate, comrades. I'll leave it there, and perhaps we can engage some of that in questions. Next slide. In terms of geothermal is essentially using heat from the earth, below the earth's surface, to heat a typically water power, a steam generator, which produces electricity. We have a comrade from Kenya Dr. Ali, who's going to hopefully talk to us about the benefits of geothermal. Kenya established the first commercial geothermal plant in Africa. It has to date 863 megawatts installed, and aims to ramp that up to 5 gigawatts by 2030. On the map on your right, you'll see, and I've included the source to that paper. There's a map of the potential easy to access geothermal resources in Africa. A lot of that's concentrated in the Rift Valley, because of the specific geological advantages there. IRENA reports that Tanzania, Zambia, and Rwanda and Uganda are already at various stages of drilling for geothermal reservoirs. Rwanda has already experienced some failed drilling attempts, and Uganda has suspended exploration from what I've seen due to funding shortfalls. So how it currently operates is that the public sector is expected to fit the bill for the drilling and exploration, and it may be IPPs that pick up the deployment and operation and running of the geothermal technologies. That's part of the model that's being suggested. Skills shortages, lack of availability for public finance for drilling and exploration have been cited as being some of the limiting factors to its wider adoption, particularly in the East Africa region where we expect it to grow. Next slide. So geothermal has a benefit of also being extremely low carbon. It's compatible with providing services, baseload services. So it is dispatchable, it can be turned on as needed. They have high energy density as well. They require relatively small amounts of land. They don't require fuel inputs. So if you're worried about the volatility of gas, diesel, and coal imports to your country, this could be one of your options. Challenges, of course, being that the projects are have a high capital cost. They're very geographically specific. In theory, you could drill in any number of places deep enough into the ground and have access to heat from geothermal energy, but that's very expensive. Drilling mainly happens in areas where there's a specific geological advantage, which makes it easy to access geothermal energy. And that may be far away from your cities or your main demand centers, which then means you have high transmission costs, which add to the cost of your project. There are risks associated that come with drilling into the ground, which may result in instability. The implications of meltdowns from the reactors may have impacts on the nearby surroundings, which includes maybe nearby villages, because these are often in far-flung areas. Due to the complexity of the construction, new transmission and the new transmission corridors that may be needed to develop geothermal power plants and connect them to the grid, these projects are likely to have very long lead times. Next slide. Wind and solar, we'll spend less time on this because it's one we're most familiar with and have discussed in our previous setting. This data was pulled from modelers at IRENA, and this gives a map of, when I say viable, this is really at the resource assessment level. South Africa has very high levels of particularly PV energy resources available across the African continent, but not every site may be advantageous for solar or wind deployment. This map is an estimation. It uses environmental satellite data to estimate where the potentially economically feasible projects may be, simply on a cost of production basis. And it estimates 4.9 terawatts of available capacity for PV and 3.4 terawatts of available capacity for wind. When you look at wind and solar plants, you have to consider the capacity factor. So for PV, the average is estimated at 21%, which means that the installed plants realize they about 21% of their rated capacity over a period of time. And the same, 55% for an average of 55% for wind. The countries that currently have wind installed, South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tunisia, currently have about 7 gigawatts of wind as of 2021. And despite the IEA says Africa has about 60% of the world's solar energy resources, but only about 1% of the installed capacity. And what are some of the reasons for that? Well, it's often reported that solar is extremely cheap. It's very dependent on the cost of capital. And we've had at length discussions yesterday about the knots we've been tied in terms of cost to capital. Availability of subsidies and the ease of regulatory permitting is also a key obstacle for the expansion of PV and wind. And transmission investments are also needed for wind and solar technologies, as often the areas where there are high resources are not, again, not necessarily where we have our high demand centers. And so if you look at South Africa, I'm most familiar with, if you look at the bottom there, you'll see a high PV and wind resource area in the Northern Cape is quite far away from some of our main demand centers in where you are in Gauteng and in the south west of the country. They're estimating around 140 billion rand required in transmission investment just alone to achieve the national energy ambitions for installing new wind and solar. That's just transmission. We haven't even gotten yet to building the actual plants. Next slide. So there are a lot of benefits. You know, it's widely accepted that wind and solar technologies will play a significant role in decarbonizing electricity grids. They do not require fuel, which again is a great benefit. Plus, if you are trying to stave off the cost of highly volatile fossil fuel prices, integrating renewable energy, though, comes with its challenges. And that is specific to each country and to each grid operating context. This is a interesting map that has come. This is from a utility in United States, and they've developed this framework. Each country will have a different set of risks with higher penetrations. You start seeing problems when you hit about 30% of your penetration of wind and solar into your national grid. And some of those problems relate to compensating for the intermittency of the resource, but also to the fact that this, you know, almost all national power systems run on AC power systems, which were designed using synchronous generators, which means electrical machines that run at 50 hertz. Wind and solar systems do not run naturally at 50 hertz. They have inverters that synthetically connect and match the profile of the grid. There are technical issues associated with having a grid that is mostly run by plants that are not naturally running at 50 hertz. And you'll see, if you can have a look at this map and the associated report to see. We can also discuss in questions if people want to take that particular area further. What it actually means is that there's two things. One, you see the pairing of wind and solar with other technologies in a number of cases. Germany, Australia, California, grids with very high wind and solar resources, next slide, sorry, have typically, so there's one, you missed a slide, I think, have high use of gas to pair, because gas plants are very quick acting and can compensate for the intermittency of renewable energy, and increased take up of battery storage systems. The next slide. Oh, okay, it's fine. Increase of battery storage systems, more investment in the transmission network for reliability improving system components, all of which contribute to the total cost of renewables. That bigger system cost is often not spoken about in our discussion. How to pay for it? Well, there's a different answer from if you're talking about the public or the private pathway. Gas, we're moving into the business end. I know I'll wrap up very soon. If we're looking at gas in the African continent, we have 108 gigawatts currently installed. Sorry, next slide. There's an issue with this version of the slides that I think it's okay. Just have that map on. I will read that particular slide from my. my side. There's about 108 gigawatts of installed gas in Africa. We have reserves in mainly in Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Mozambique. Mozambique currently holds, I think, 25% of the reserve base for existing liquefied natural gas or natural gas reserves, but is estimated to produce in the next 10 years 30% of what is currently available will come in new capacity additions from Mozambique alone. Unfortunately, in Mozambique, gas exploration is also tied to war, of Total, a French multinational, which has its eye on Mozambican gas. Europe is looking to substitute its use of natural gas from Europe by acquiring more natural gas exports from the African continent. Next slide. Most of the new gas capacity additions are actually also cited from, while it's heavily in use in North Africa, Nigeria and South Africa account for about half of the new expected gas power plants in the next 10 years. Gas plants are highly capable of providing baseload power, but also flexible power for pairing with wind and solar. Open cycle gas turbines have very high ramp rates, which have that advantage, and that's why they are used in Germany, South Australia, and California. Geographical siting is flexible, allowing these technologies to be deployed to areas where grid capacity may exist, but you have the challenge of how to transport the gas from the point of entry, or either point of extraction or point of import onto where your plant is built. Technology is well established and used across the African continent. Challenges: gas prices are very volatile, especially where gas is imported, and often dollar denominated. So you're hit by on two levels: volatility of the dollar and of your currency in relation to the dollar, and then of the gas price itself. Gas plants still burn fossil fuels, which increase greenhouse gas emissions. Fracking for gas causes significant environmental damage. The historical legacy of communities displaced by fracking has failed to yield positive benefits that have often been purported from the economic benefits from the actual extraction of gas. It's directly implicated with wartime resource competition and conflict in Mozambique, which our comrades have spoken to a little bit, but will maybe speak to again, Comrade Helder. And there's also a risk that some of the gas infrastructure that is put up to extract gas may result in stranded assets as gas is phased out, either due to a shift in economics of energy production as cheaper resources become more available, or because carbon sanctions like the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism make it unfeasible to be using gas in local economies. Next slide. I'm going to discuss two storage technologies. We won't have time to go into battery storage, but carbon capture and storage, or CCS or CCUS, U being utilization, is a term or phrase that actually covers quite a large number of groups of technologies. The two groups can be separated into carbon capture and carbon removal systems. Basic examples, if we think of a direct air capture and storage system where carbon dioxide that is, or pollutant that comes from a fossil fuel burning plant, passes through a filter which solidifies and stores the carbon dioxide into a substrate, which is then stored deep into ground or used as a byproduct for some industrial process. So carbon capture and storage technologies are largely in early stage development. high estimated costs have been a barrier to the further development in many applications. In terms of the African continent, a lot of the CCS has been focused on South Africa, which was no surprise because of the high presence of coal use. In 2009, the World Bank established a program to develop a regulatory framework and assess the techno-economic options for CCS projects. There's I've struggled to find up-to-date information of what actually was the outcome and why it was abandoned, but it appears clear in some of the reports that that lack of interest and lack of appetite to fund CCS is among them. Sasol, the partially state-owned fuel company in South Africa, in 2021 announced that it will, end of this year, develop a CCS facility that will be able to store 10,000 to 50,000 metric tons of CO2 per year at a depth below 1 kilometer below the surface in the Vaal region of South Africa, not too far from where you are. A year later, they announced a joint initiative with ArcelorMittal, a steel company, to develop a green hydrogen and CCU, carbon capture and utilization projects, to produce low carbon steel and to decarbonize chemical production. We'll see if those materialize, but they are aiming to get government support and pilot some of these technologies. Next slide. The IEA has developed a carbon capture and storage tracker, which you can check. You can Google for it, and you'll see they're using their databases to track the development of carbon capture technologies. You can see that Africa accounts for a very small percentage of that capacity. We barely even feature on the map. North America has heavily included carbon capture storage in its projections for its future development to meet its 2030 targets, and they account for a huge chunk. Whereas Europe has also included a significant amount of planned carbon capture storage. We'll see if it materializes. One of the barriers, especially for so-called developing countries, is that again, the technology is early stage and regarded as costly, and there's a question about whether the risks out of the costs outweigh other alternative short-term solutions, and these require concrete answers and feasibility studies to reasonably justify an answer. So, next slide. Green hydrogen. So, what is green hydrogen? Hydrogen fuels essentially an energy storage form of energy storage. Purified water is used to separate, hydrogen is produced from purified water by separating the hydrogen molecule using a device called an electrolyzer, which is powered by a renewable energy resource. The source of power is what makes it classified as green. Green hydrogen fuels have been identified by a number of global north economies, particularly in Western Europe, as a partial replacement for fossil gas in the medium term. Of course, there's extra added incentive for doing that because of the Russia-Ukraine war. The EU in particular is looking to incentivize decarbonization of various industrial processes as well, and vehicle transport. And that also accounts for some of the demand for green hydrogen that will be used for decarbonizing chemicals, but also steel production. Since the fuel is is dependent on the availability of high quality renewable energy resources, countries with these resources are targets for joint projects. So there's a challenge here that the demand is mainly in Europe, and some in North America, some in China. But some of the areas where there's high potential lie in Latin America, Australia, Africa, and parts of Asia. And so the point of production is likely to be in those places and transported. Green hydrogen is currently very expensive, transportation and storage particularly so. hydrogen molecules are technically challenging and logistically difficult to transport. Some of the trade-offs, there are many we could discuss, but some of the particular ones that are relevant to us is that there's already a shift in foreign direct investment for renewable energy, attitudes that are looking to invest renewable energy for developing green hydrogen as opposed to developing renewable energy for domestic electricity consumption. So there may be competition there, which will negatively impact our access question. It is also reliant on access to high quality water resources. You need good quality water to develop green hydrogen, and that may come into conflict with the needs of nearby communities where green hydrogen plants are built. Electrolyzers are the key technologies for production, and the advantage with that technology is held in some of the countries that are sponsoring the development of green hydrogen, particularly the case of Germany. And so they may be unwilling to transfer that technology. A great example of where these trade-offs show up is that Australian multinational Fortescue Metals Group is developing a plan to produce green hydrogen powered from the Green Ender Dam project, and yet for export. And yet, there are domestic concerns that Grand Inga is not delivering either its developmental mandate in terms of building broad aspects of the economy or even basic services. Next slide. So there are a number of green hydrogen projects that are currently under development in the African continent. Looking at Namibia, South Africa, Morocco, Mauritania, and Egypt. All of the countries that are listed that have green hydrogen projects are aiming to export. There are only a subsection of them are looking at domestic industrial applications. I think particularly for steel and ammonia production, this may mean an opportunity for high value goods for export. I think I expected that the demand for green steel will also be international and not domestic. And so there may be a trade-off here that is worth discussing about the need for using green hydrogen to get for the sale of high value commodities, the benefits of which could be used for other things, which brings into question the ownership and public pathway question. Next slide, I think it's the last one. I know it's been a long journey with me, comrades, and maybe next time we can find ways to have a session with other targeted members for different technologies to break it up and to split it up. But I think to summarize, some of the key implications for the public pathway are that, one, the message is that we need credible, well-resourced public energy planning mechanisms that are capable of weighing up the advantages and disadvantages of different technologies, and also convening stakeholders in a credible manner to ensure, there are trade-offs with different technologies. We have to acknowledge that. Regional infrastructure and planning coordination is critical for a continental plan for universal access. Building an intracontinental transmission network dramatically transforms the economics of delivering power. Comrade Ernest shared with us in Nairobi that even the building transmission infrastructure, connecting it from Ethiopia to Kenya, changed the economics for the viability of various IPP plants that had protected prices. It was cheaper available power from Ethiopia that you wouldn't have maybe needed the expensive lock-in prices from IPPs that were agreed in years prior. Establishing common definitions for energy poverty. So the scale of rural solutions really depends on the scale of our ambition. And I can't underscore that enough. So for public pathway, having common definitions for what we mean by quality access is important. And finally, technology transfer and skills development is key and will require collaboration. Different countries have different skill bases and advantages and are starting from different places. We need to discuss how we can strategically attack this question of technology transfer and capture technologies that are built elsewhere within the continent and share, and also upgrade the levels of skills across transmission, distribution, and generation. So I'm sorry, Chair, for taking long, and I'll hand over back to you.
Thanks so much, Brian. And thanks for taking us on that very comprehensive journey of technologies. And we will have this presentation available. So if people want a copy, can sort of see everything in one place, the whole landscape of technologies in the region. We'll have that available, as well as other presentations and interventions that people have given. So my proposal right now is that we take the break and come back and have the panel and Wanda Stile facilitating, and come back in 20 minutes as it says on the program. We're just splitting that session into 2 right now. Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, comrades. So we'll see you back in about 20 minutes. What time would that be? Yeah, 11:40, thanks.
We are starting in the next 5 minutes, please.
Welcome back, comrades. We're going to get started soon. Please have a seat.
Good morning, comrades. Can we sit down to those that are still standing up? Thanks, comrades. My name is Wandisile Pram. I'm a shop steward from the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. I'll be facilitating this session on the energy options, debates on fuels and technologies in Africa. Brian tried to assist to shape the discussion as we are going to give it to the panelists next to me. But it's important, comrades, to highlight or just to remind the House about some of the key issues that were highlighted by Brian, in particular, looking at 6 technologies. Started basically with nuclear, where he went at length about the low carbon benefits from the nuclear side, and he would have touched about the cost, but in particular, he stressed the lead times as a sort of a disadvantage, on the technology side. He went to touch geothermal as well. He highlighted the cost about it, and also the lead times that seems to be problematic. Wind and solar, I think everyone seems to be on par. He didn't spend time on it. It's a well-known fact that wind and solar will continue to dominate, the energy landscape for many years to come. He touched on the gas, which is a fossil fuel, which is currently being used by a lot of countries, European countries, Australians, Americans, especially for peaking, and in some instances to assist those countries with their reliability issues. On the carbon capture, the hydrogen, you would have highlighted the issues of maturity, where these technologies have not really matured enough, where they are commercially available in the market to an extent. They are widely used. You would have noted the latest report from Lazard, which quantifies the levelized cost of electricity would have categorized those technologies as well to be maturing technologies because of the cost as well. They are not rolled out throughout the whole globe, but the particular focus for us is to focus on Africa. What is our options? Also highlighting the challenges as well that are currently confronting these challenges. And on the program, we would have, appreciated to have an input from the NUM General Secretary, but currently is not here. He was going to cover the South African aspect, but will try and assist as well. I think, comrades, on the issue of the technologies and fuels, normally it's a contentious debate because there seems to be a polarized in such a manner that there is a belief that there must be a one winner for all, and it does not happen in any way in the world. I think a just energy mix should be the line that we must follow, but obviously taking into consideration that it must be in the public hands, not as it currently happening across the globe. Just to touch on the South Africa landscape, there's been a lot of debates about what must constitute our energy mix, and as such, the debate has been influenced by a lot of NGOs, a lot of environmentalists, a lot of, the guys from the industry as well, to an extent, the IRP of 2019, which shaped, an additional capacity of more than 20,000 from the renewables, which shaped as well 3,000 megawatts from gas, which is recently released, to be out in the market, which shaped as well the 2,500 nuclear, which as well will be released to the market. But the discussion seems to be centered mainly about advocating for the renewable sources. And it's a correct debate. But however, the debate seems to be somewhat not to highlight the limitations that are confronting the renewables, in particular solar and wind, at a utility scale point of view. Because you would recall that countries like, for example, that have went to go at a much rapid pace, Germany, for an example, with an installed capacity of 136 gigawatts, equally, it can meet their demand of maximum 76,000 megawatts by using the fossil fuels, in particular, the coal and gas. So the debate somehow in the other countries, like in the USA as well, they rely solely on the gas, technology to meet their demand. And somewhere, somehow, in South Africa, we tend to be caught in an understanding that wind and solar is going to meet our demand. And practically speaking, it's not the case. For an example, just only last week when we had stage 6, the production from solar and wind was quite low because of the intermittence. It is a well-known view that the energy produced from solar and wind tends to vary between the seasons. And this is one of the seasons where wind and solar is not producing so much. And in instances, if you look at the 10 minutes or the hourly average produced data from the current installed capacity of the renewables, in some instances, you get less than 10%. And during critical periods of peaking, and in those instances, the question that should be asked, what is then that is going to supplement, the renewables in ensuring that the issue of reliability, the issue of security, is guaranteed to the consumers. So it's one of the issues as well that I think the House must ponder over it. Another issue I think that has been a thorny issue is the issue of nuclear as a technology, as we're aware that at some point there was a start of it, but somewhere, somehow, due to some procedural irregularities on the government side, the courts were not allowed, to grant the plan for the nuclear, which was 9,600, megawatts in South Africa. And as such, the developments across the world, given the Russia-Ukrainian war, has shifted in a way about meeting the climate goals. So now the talk of looking into nuclear as a reliable source to meet the demand 24/7, the talk is somewhere around there. I'm sure would have picked up that the budget speech from Rishi Sunak would have highlighted that as well, to say they are going to invest so much in nuclear because it's been a proven technology that has been there. It's a technology that has matured, but quite frankly, it's a technology that is able to give us electricity at ultra low, emissions. But of particular note in South Africa as well, we've got the case of Quebec, which currently is producing electricity at 19 cents per kilowatt hour, which is low by any scale as compared to the other technologies that we're using. Just to make an example, the open cycle gas turbines that we're currently using to supplement the peaking, it's around 6 rand per kilowatt hour. So compare 19 cents and 6 rand and see on the issues that would have been raised about access to electricity, the issue of affordability, which technology indeed, that is going to assist. So as I'm going to allow, Comrade Mariana Diallo to also give input on this matter, I thought I must highlight, comrades, those technologies because I think it's one of the technologies that are going to shape the future, not because are the technologies that are coming from our minds. The Intergovernmental Panel report on climate change, the 6th edition, the mitigation report, it's clear about these technologies. In fact, it goes at lengths to say at some point they need to complement each other. It makes no sense for you to have resources in your country and you don't want to use your resources because there's a stigma around a certain technology. I'll make, for an example, in South Africa, there is a whole issue about our coal-generated power station. To an extent, one of the things that are normally stressed enough is the fact that if you are going to close these power stations, you run a risk of stranding assets that are going to span 200 years. You run a risk of closing down, the whole province of Mpumalanga. And as we are currently speaking, the technology which is part of the RP 2019, you look at the global production of solar and wind is currently dominated by China. So what you will see basically, it will be the destruction of jobs where we are going to import a lot of these PV modules, a lot of wind turbine components that are going to destroy the jobs of many South Africans. So as we are going to shape the discussion, it's important as also to balance, the interest of also the public as we are going to meet, the national determined contribution. And also, I think the last part, Mariana, that I want to highlight about the national determined contributions, because the discussion somehow seems to be misplaced in a way that seeks to suggest that the developing countries are compelled to reduce the greenhouse emission gases in line with their national determined contribution. And it's not the case. The developing countries are categorized as the countries in terms of the Annexure 1 of the Kyoto Protocol, not to be compelled, but they are encouraged, to reduce, the greenhouse emissions. But I think an important point on the Paris Agreement, it's Article 4, which encourages, in fact, the developing countries to move over time, in reducing their greenhouse emissions in light of the national circumstances. Now, if you talk about Africa, what is your national circumstances? What are your national priorities? You know that in Africa, we've got a problem where a huge population does not have access to electricity. That's one. In South Africa, if you look at it currently as we're speaking, we're in a crisis where people don't have electricity for almost 11 hours in a day. Those are the national priorities. So as we're shaping this discussion, I want us to be mindful as well about the issue of the national determined contribution, raising it in the context of the Paris Agreement. So with those words, ladies and gents, I'm going to give it to Mariana Diallo from UTTS as well to assist. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Salut, camarades. Camarades, salut. Merci beaucoup. Je suis Mariama Diallo. Je suis la secrétaire générale de l'UDTS au Sénégal. Le Sénégal, c'est un petit pays par rapport au Nigeria et l'Afrique du Sud, mais un grand pays par rapport au Bénin et le Togo. le Sénégal, quand on parle du Sénégal, on devait dire un pays qui est excessivement ou expressément ou grandement riche de par sa situation géographique. Les limité à l'est à l'est-sud et au nord, il y a le fleuve Sénégal où il y a le barrage de Diamant, de Manantali, où il y a des normes d'électricité au niveau de ce barrage. Il y a des lacs aussi au niveau qui alimentent pratiquement tout le Sénégal en eau. Il y a aussi la Gambie qui est une embouchure, le fleuve Gambie et l'océan Atlantique, en grosso modo. Et nous avons 700 km de côte pour notre cher pays qui était stable jusqu'à quelques jours, qui est devenu un peu... Il y a beaucoup de problèmes par rapport à la politique. Mais j'espère que ça ira. Chers camarades, comme vous le savez, l'électricité est devenue un intrant essentiel pour mener une ville digne, car elle améliore l'accès aux biens publics tels que l'eau, les soins de santé et l'éducation. Bon, par rapport à l'extension de l'électrification de manière réalisable en tant que droit fondamental, au Sénégal, pour atteindre l'objectif d'extension de l'électrification en tant que droit fondamental, les autorités ont misé sur les projets de production d'électricité qui visent à une bonne couverture de la demande, une diversification des ressources de production et une baisse des coûts de l'électricité. Les premiers résultats de la mise en œuvre de ces projets dans le domaine de la production d'électricité sont effectifs avec la mise au service des centrales. On a à peu près 10 centrales au Sénégal, suite à des projets de réhabilitation, d'extension ou construction de 2 nouvelles installations mises en service en 2016. IPP Toben Pao, fonctionnant au full lourd ou au gaz naturel pour une puissance de 100 MW d'un coût de 120 milliards. Il y a compteur global fonctionnant au full lourd aussi ou au gaz naturel pour une puissance de 82 MW et d'un coût de 91,5 milliards. À ces résultats de la production d'électricité s'ajoute le renforcement de mix énergétique qui est devenu une réalité avec l'inauguration et la mise en service d'une puissance en énergie renouvelable de 40 MW, plaçant ainsi le Sénégal comme un pionnier de la promotion des énergies renouvelables dans la sous-région. Il s'agit de la mise en service en 2016 des centrales solaires que sont Synergie 2 pour une puissance de 20 MW, la Solarie qui m'a pour une puissance de 20 MW. Mon camarade parlait tout à l'heure de l'Allemagne. L'Allemagne nous a beaucoup inspiré et c'est un partenaire privilégié. Il nous a aidés surtout sur les énergies solaires, panneaux solaires et surtout dans les villages les plus reculés du Sénégal. En 2012, la puissance totale installée était de 674,5 MW et au 31 décembre 2016, cette puissance a été portée à 848 MW. Il est à signaler que dans le cadre du plan Sénégal émergence, PSE, le gouvernement s'est engagé à atteindre l'accès universel à l'électricité en 2025, avec un objectif intermédiaire d'un taux d'électrification rurale de 60% en 2017-2020. Ainsi, le nombre de localités rurales électrifiées au Sénégal est passé de 1648 en 2012 à 3173 en 2016, représentant une progression de 92,5% sur la période, soit 1525 villages supplémentaires électrifiés. À terme, l'objectif visé est de réduire la dépendance énergétique et alléger la facture pétrolière. À titre d'illustration, le programme de réduction des factures publiques d'électricité a permis aussi, parce qu'il y avait eu une réduction des factures d'électricité, réaliser une économie de 3 milliards par an sur la facture publique d'électricité au bout de 3 ans de mise en œuvre. Et pour la fourniture d'une électricité abordable, qui peut servir d'intrant pour aider à développer une fabrication et une valorisation locale significative, La première phase de la mise en œuvre de l'extension de l'électrification, précédemment décrite, a permis de baisser le coût de production à 5,26 francs CFA le kilowatt-heure à fin 2016, alors qu'il était à 101,92 kWh en 2012. Cette baisse des tarifs de l'électricité a atteint 10% depuis le 1er janvier 2017. Et cette fourniture d'électricité abordable combinée à des actions planifiées qui vulgarisent en milieu rural la technologie de biogaz a permis à 10 000 ménages ruraux, cantines scolaires et daara, écoles coraniques, d'accéder plus facilement à une énergie de cuisson propre. Par rapport à ça, au niveau du nord du Sénégal, à Saint-Louis, il y a des gens qui ont fabriqué à l'aide du soleil pour faire cuire le thiéboudienne. Tu as un appareil, tu le mets au soleil et tu peux cuire ton thiéboudienne ou bien ton riz au poisson ou bien ton mafé ou le poisson et ça cuit sans gaz ni comment dirais-je charbon, mais c'est le soleil. Ça, c'est vraiment extraordinaire. Je le vis au niveau de Saint-Louis. Et si on pouvait vraiment faire partager cela dans tout le Sénégal et partout en Afrique aussi, ça serait une bonne chose parce qu'on a du soleil. Et cette stratégie contribue aussi à la réduction de la pauvreté par la création d'opportunités d'emploi non agricoles en zone rurale avec l'émergence de corps de métier, artisans et maçons, dont la vocation est de construire les biodigesteurs, à fabriquer les accessoires et pièces détachées, l'augmentation de revenus issus des activités agricoles. Et la construction d'un système à une échelle considérable tout en limitant des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, conformément aux contributions déterminées au niveau national. Il est à rappeler que 3 gaz à effet de serre sont responsables de 98% des effets. Il y a le gaz carbonique, le méthane et protoxyde d'azote. Ces gaz contribuent au réchauffement climatique parce qu'ils absorbent le rayonnement infrarouge émis par la surface terrestre. La contribution déterminée au niveau national TUED du Sénégal s'inscrit dans le cadre de la vision prospective Plan Sénégal émergent, de sa stratégie et des plans de développement ainsi que des programmes sectoriels de gestion durable et de ses ressources naturelles et environnementales. En 2015, le Sénégal, par le biais de la CDN, s'est engagé de réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre par rapport aux émissions projetées à l'horizon 2035. Aussi, une évaluation rigoureuse de la situation environnementale a permis d'identifier les secteurs d'émissions de gaz, de serre, le transport, des déchets, l'énergie, l'industrie, tout ça, les domaines sensibles portant de façon prioritaire les activités d'adaptation et de maîtrise des impacts du changement climatique, l'érosion côtière, agriculture, élevage, santé, tout ça. La CDN a fixé pour chacun des secteurs des objectifs dont l'agrégation sera traduite par une réduction relative aux serres de 5% et 7%, respectivement aux environs 2025 et 2030. Cette réduction pourrait être portée à 23% et 29% respectivement aux horizons 25 et 2030 par rapport à la situation de référence si le Sénégal bénéficie de soutien de la communauté internationale et des financements conséquents. Pas avoir beaucoup de dettes de la Banque mondiale quand même. La CDN du Sénégal contient un large éventail d'activités d'atténuation dans les secteurs de l'énergie, de l'agriculture, de l'industrie et des déchets. Et des résultats ont été obtenus dans beaucoup d'actions en mise en œuvre visant à réduire, voire éliminer la consommation. Il s'agit de l'élimination à la consommation de CF depuis 2010, la prévision de la réduction de la consommation, l'élimination totale et la prévision de la réduction de la consommation de tout ça. Pour terminer, il est à signaler que le Sénégal représente 5% de la production énergétique de l'UMOA et au regard de sa distribution sectorielle, on constate que le secteur des ménages et celui des transports représentent à eux seuls 83% de la consommation énergétique finale totale au Sénégal. Comparé aux émissions moyennes mondiales, le Sénégal émet peu de COD. Et si, comme le prévoit le protocole de Tokyo, un marché carbone se met en place et le pays pourra en profiter pour vendre des permis d'émission aux pays du Nord. Pour une contribution d'un système à échelle considérable qui limite les émissions de gaz à effet de serre, le Sénégal devra maîtriser d'abord la planification de l'adaptation au niveau national qui doit intégrer une approche de planification dans le court et moyen et long terme, le cadre réglementaire aussi et des moyens de mise en œuvre des engagements, la mise en place aussi d'une approche multisectorielle et enfin, l'élaboration d'une stratégie de communication efficace. Je crois que mon cher pays, s'il continue à travailler ainsi, je crois que nous n'aurons pas besoin de la Banque mondiale ou bien des pays européens ou des pays asiatiques. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, comrades. Now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ali to come and give us his input on the topic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I will interact with my slides for 7 minutes, then I'll discuss off the slides for 8 minutes. I think I'll take at most or not less than 15 minutes. First, I want you to appreciate the element of the Kenyan context of the options that are available so that we can learn from each other. I know we have learned a lot from the other players who are here so that we can put what we are planning into practice by benchmarking. Irene, if you can put up the slides, I'll appreciate. Okay, this is, I want to discuss the Kenyan context of the energy options available. But I want to start with a quote, which says a transition to clean energy is about making an investment in our future. I think that is what we agree. As we talk about going green, as much as we are discussing more importantly through the public way. My presentation will be based on the following. I will not discuss into detail, but on a brief, so that I can give the African context, sub-Saharan African and the global South countries later. So I want you to appreciate the current position of power in Kenya. Look at the riding factors of the visions of 2030 that we have in Kenya, looking at the future power demand, future power mix, Kenya energy options, conclusions. In the future power mix, I will not discuss much about the nuclear energy because that is something in proportion to the vision 2030 with the objective of achieving 4 gigawatts to enable sustainability of power in the economy. This is, I know numbers are very boring. I will not take you through all these numbers. Current power capacity in Kenya is this. I know that numbers has shifted, hydro and thermal. Thermal is shifting to high more than 70%. And this is as data as 2021. These are the current facts. Next. The current facts that we have. Go to slide number 5. The current facts that we have in Kenya at the moment is on May 2023, government scrapped subsidies for diesel and kerosene. You can go to the next, Irene. Yeah. In Kenya, the government has scrapped subsidies for diesel and kerosene. That's a fact that we have to live in as much as we are looking to the cost of element in power sector in terms of accessibility. The other thing that power generation in Kenya rose by 4.5% in financial year 2021 to 2022. And on January 2023, Kenyan, which is the main generator, plans to deploy 3 gigawatts of renewable over the next 10 years toward the vision that we have. Next. This is just an overview of the mix of the energies we have in terms of generation, wind, hydro, imports of solar, then we have imports, thermal and geothermal. So basically here, what we are talking about, thermal is 10% compared to the consumptions we have in the country. Next, the prevailing factors in the power sector that affects the distribution, the generation, and also the supply end user is rampant frauds and electricity of thefts, high electricity prices, which is caused by global influxes from Ukraine, Russia war, among others, high system losses. I think Brian has mentioned this, but in Kenya, we have 23.3% of which we produce, that's our system losses. That means of everything that we produce, 1.0% is of power procured is lost. So we have a high system losses, and this is what we are gearing. I'm going to give you the way forward and what we developed to mitigate this. Then lastly, we have unstable power prices caused by volatile oil prices, which is the global recessions and the global effects. And next, this is, I want you to appreciate the electric supply chain and the users. Okay. This is the electric supply chain, and the value, these are generic, and it is common to most African countries and even the global setup. I want you only to appreciate, I think these slides are available for your consumption later. But this is my area of indulgence because we want to talk about fuel rebates and debates of fuels and technology. I want to give the vision, the basic visions of Kenya, which are three riding factors to affordable. One of them is availability of power. And in this, we say that energy, enough energy to meet current and future needs is what we are talking about. One of the things that we have done in this country is that we ensure that we have a lot of energy available. Kenya is one of the countries that's endowed with the geothermal and natural gas. And the generations that are now taken up is, as we speak today, we have 80+% of renewable energy in Kenya. And this has not been an easy task, I know, for most of us, because we had to go through a lot of capacity assessment and capacity change, skill building from other countries. I want to remind you on this. Geothermal technology expertise, Kenya is one of the leading. The expertise, people working in Kenya were trained in Iceland. You know, Iceland is one of the countries globally that use 80% of the as geothermal. Skills to impart other regional partners, including Ethiopia, Rwanda, and the likelies. Last week, we had, I think in Kenya, we had a G2G, generation to generation innovation. And we have opened doors for regional partners to come and participate. Kenya also, in these sectors of the energy, we innovate, we open innovation and create a platform and environment for innovation and reward innovation, even in and outside the institution. The other factor that we need at the basic function is affordability. And this is one thing that will going to come into discussion when we are talking about technology. As much as we want to go to a technology, how affordable is this technology? And what is the paradigm shift from the existing status quo to the new technology? So consumers can afford to buy for energy. Companies can earn through a stay in business, because at the end of the day, we have to make income for public utilities to ensure that there are proper running policies that are in place. Lastly, on the vision, we talked about acceptable environmental compatibility, which we talked about just transition in the green way, and public acceptance. Are the public also accepting this? In Kenya, what we do, we always, the freedom of speech is there. We open the airwaves to ensure that every project that is coming up is subjected to public participation and public engagement before it's adapted to it is used. Next. Then power is one of the enabler of Kenya towards the Vision 2030. And the Vision 2030 describes the way Kenya will be transformed from a low-income agrarian economy to a newly industrialized middle-income country, providing a high quality of life to its citizens. It also talks about as a goal, the goal is based on 3 pillars: 1, political stability, social development, and economic growth. The economic objectives supporting the Vision 2030 require an annual GDP growth of at least 10% to be reached by the year 2015, of which I know Kenya has surpassed that. The Vision 2030 identifies energy and electricity as a key element of Kenya's sustained economic growth and transformation, Kenya Vision 2030. Next. Kenya Vision 2030 The country remains at enhancing and diversifying national power generation and supply, identifying new generation and supply resources. Nuclear energy, and I know Brian has talked about, nuclear energy has been identified as one of the sources of energy that will substantially address the prevailing energy deficit, and according to established nuclear electricity project committee that is in discussion. And towards the vision 2030, Kenya is up to initiating a nuclear energy that will going to contribute to the national grid 4 gigawatts to sustain power supply for vibrant economy towards the vision. If you look at this diagram, the pillars are very clear, and economic, social, and political, but underlining that, we never forgot the element of innovation, internal owned innovation, which we call the homemade innovation, which is science, technology, and innovation. Kenya is one of the countries, I think, would have more accessibility to information technology than any other African country. I have traveled to Germany, China, and other countries, and I know we surpass them, we lead them, and they follow us. Remember, Kenya is also a home of M-Pesa platforms, the mobile technology platforms. So technology uptake is very high. And the usage of internet to inform citizens are also very high. In that line, the government has also opened up ICT cities to ensure internal incubation of the innovation, and innovation is also harnessed at local levels. If you look at the flagship project with large demand, next slide. If you look at the projects that have undergone for the last 5-6 years, and some of them are just recently completed, that has created a large demand of energy requirements, of which the generator and the distributor has lived to this objective to this date. ICT Park, which I said is the innovation center that's open to the public. Second, container terminal, I think expansion of our ports so that our partners, our regional platform neighbors can also tap from these resources. Standard gauge railway, Lamu Port, special economic zones that we have opened up, iron and steel melting industry in Meru, standard gauge railway Mombasa, Nairobi, Kisumu, which is a connector of the region. I think it will also connect to Uganda and neighboring countries, light rail for Nairobi. These are some of the projects that call for and demand for more energies so that we can sustain them. And therefore the need for energy still is growing. If you look at the load next slide, if you look at the load forecast synthesis, we have geothermal, wind, and cogeneration, and solar. And if you look at the three first element that is growing so high, is geothermal, wind, and solar. And this is looks like it's the future for Kenya, because that is where the opportunities are and the resources are available. Load forecast for Kenya for 2031 looks like that also. I don't want to read the figures. I know figures are very boring to most of us, but I will leave this for consumption. And projected power generation mix for 2031, we cannot ignore this, because as much as we have a vision for 2030, we need to achieve the projected mix. Kenya's power industry generation and transmission system planning is undertaken on the basis of 20-year rolling, what we call Least Cost Power Development Plan, LCBDP, which is updated every year so that we can realize the milestones we have achieved. It's estimated that 2011 peak load have grown from 13 times by the year, will grow to that 2031, and forecasted peak demand for 2021 in Kenya will be 15,026 megawatts, of which at the moment as we speak, we have surpassed the production of this vision. I think we need to renew our ideas on that. The government also of Kenya, through the least cost demand, for the period of 2011-2021, identified geothermal is the least cost choice of technology to meet Kenya's growing energy demand. The cumulative geothermal demand target 5.5 gigawatts for the planning period, which is equivalent to 26% of the system peak demand by 2031. Wind and hydro power plants will still provide 95% of the total capacity respectively by 2031. This looks like this. This is the graphical representation of what we anticipate to achieve by 2031. And in my last slide, Kenya energy options remain green. And which is geothermal is the first one, and the natural gas and solar is the other one. With that, I think in conclusion, I want to also remind you that Kenya is not only using green and everywhere, but also we are riding green and electric. I think Bruno will agree to me that when he was in Nairobi, he saw that we have a number of buses. GOK is hopeful to reach, the government of Kenya is hopeful to reach 100% clean energy by 2030, according to ESI Africa, and more electric buses for Nairobi public transport fleet is also not seen now. I think this is one big shift from fossil fuel. If you allow me, facilitator, I will wander away from the list and give me 5 minutes to also create an Africa perception on elements of where our priorities are in terms of technology. I think we learned from each other, and I really appreciate that our earlier presenters have talked about technology, and more commonly, Brian has talked about so oftenly on technology and where the shift is towards, again, what is our role in this technology. And we need also to talk about and emphasize on the fact that we need to maximize existing clean energy options. But the question in the minds of many will remain, which one and for which country is which one? Still, diversity will still play at place. Innovation in advanced technology is an area that we cannot ignore. As much as we talk about green energy, then we talk about what are we producing to this green energy. So areas of solar and components that are used for green energy is an area we need to discuss and bring solutions to the societies that we live. Innovation is just what we cannot avoid. Innovation, I think in Kenya, we have taken it very seriously, that we incubate and reward internal innovation. Today, we are talking about green energy, but if you look at the dynamics of green energy consumers, when the global north is pushing the global south to decarbonize and take green energy, then we have a question to ask ourselves: where are we getting from these components? Are we producing from ourselves, or we are buying it from them? We are buying solar and batteries from the global north countries, which we consume still their products. And sustainability in terms of skill transfer is becoming an issue that we need to discuss. And looking at Kenya case, where Kenyan has trained its geothermal experts in Iceland, then we also need to negotiate with partners who are providing solutions in terms of equipment to ensure that there is enough knowledge transfer to our institutions. Reducing fossil fuel while recognizing natural gas as a cleaner energy transition fuel in areas where cleaner energy cannot be deployed is also an equal measure that we need to consider. We need to know this. Choice of energy path resources is resource dependent. The choice of energy path that we want to use is resource dependent. I know Brother Kimanzi has put it very clearly, the cost element ascertained by the factors, the elements of energy solutions that we have talked about. So sometimes we don't need to hallucinate. We need to also look at the resources available in terms of finance, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of how long can we take a technology uptake? Is it a short term or long term? This is one thing we need to consider. As we also bond the energy feature in sub-Saharan Africa as a clean energy, we need not to forget also the public pathway, because sometimes they are underlying factors to green energy. We can give you green energy, yes, but the condition is, and my brother Anes have talked about in the morning, that these are the conditions. You have to go private. This is what we need to resist. As much as we are looking for green energy, technology that are based to green economy, then we also need to look at the bigger picture of who manages and who owns and who reaps from this. Is it the public or private sector that we talked about, the IPPs, the parasitic nature of them taking money from the society without looking in the bigger effect that would leave to the environment. It's a topical discussion, and I want to juggle your mind on our understanding in the changing role of natural gas in emerging economy in sub-Saharan Africa. This is also one thing that we need to look at it. The natural gas, we have plenty of resources in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, and mostly even the global south. We need to benchmark ourselves, import our ideas. Our governments are policymakers. The policymakers are appointed or elected by us, the followers of the societies and the controllers of the bigger population of these nations. The labor movement is one of the highest number of people in terms of composition and in terms of population. You want to tell me we don't control and we cannot inform our people the decisions to which we appoint our people. So that accountability to our end starts accountability from our end. We don't need to complain and blame ourselves that the government. Who is the government? That's what we need to ask ourselves. And to the global facts, in the global South dream, we are all dreaming to have affordable energy for all global South countries, and which is we see this as an immediate priority. But however, the question again, we need to ask ourselves, because I want to ask you a lot of questions, leave you thinking about this, is how and when we need to achieve this. Where are our priorities and how and when we need. Just a brief outlook in my summary. African is an evolving global context, and without leaving the other global South partners. And today, global energy crisis has underscored the urgency as well as the benefits of accelerated scale-up of a cheaper and cleaner sources of energy. I know most of our development in terms of infrastructure was slowed by pandemic COVID-19, but that is not something to worry about it, because we have to leave our past behind and live with the present. And the only way we can achieve this, the solution for Africa is in homemade innovation, homemade grown solution, because you don't wait somebody to come and manage your house for you. The only way we can do that is we can get ideas and skills from more developed countries, harness it to our local context, and create a public ownership in that context. That is the only way we can create. So demand for energy in sub-Saharan Africa and the global South is set to grow rapidly. I think that is fact that we all are allowed to. And maintaining affordable remains an urgent priority this. No, we talked about accessibility. We talked about everything element that we need to connect the national public, the citizenship of this country. And this is a fact that the demand is growing day by day by expansion of our boundaries and businesses. I know we have vehicles for connecting East Africa. Example, if I use East Africa, we have the East Africa Power Bull that is connecting to cities and regions to regions. Electricity will underpin Africa's economic feature, with solar leading the way. And that's what my brother has alluded to it. And in our case in Kenya, geothermal will going to lead the way, followed by solar. We need also to look at this. Gas and oil production focuses on meeting Africans' on demand for this decade. But however, the element of what is clean and what is not clean is again questionable. And I think I like how somebody else was talking about it yesterday. The element of clean versus accessibility versus affordability. This is something that we also need to talk about. We are saying it should be clean, affordable, but from the statistics that have been shared across, always fossil fuel is costly compared to other energy solutions. Critical minerals are present and major economic opportunity for Africa. So how do we use our minerals to be a negotiating platform? How do we use our resources in terms of natural resources so that we can trade off with partners who have what we don't have? I was much pleased with my brother from Ghana when he said, when we were talking of the meeting, Ghana is trading with United Arab Emirates on issue of gold for fuel. That has taken the cost of electricity 50% down. So we need also to look at trade-offs. Major economic opportunities that we have is what we have. Unless we see what we have, then we will not be able to feel the value of what we have. It's only when you lose it, you'll know what you have. So Africa can become a leading player in hydrogen. I want to emphasize on the aspect of hydrogen. I know my brother Kimanzi have also talked about hydrogen, but I want to give a solution to hydrogen. Where can we get this hydrogen? Hydrogen made from renewables. I know Egypt, Morocco, Mauritania, Namibia, and South Africa, some of them produce a high number of ammonia in the cost of production of their fertilizer, which the presence of hydrogen is present. Hydrogen produced by these fertilizers, according to Energy African Outlook 2023 said, it is 5,000 megatons, equivalent with USD 2 less per kilogram if you equate it into the dollar form. What does it mean? Then Africa itself or global South countries are producing ammonia, which is a set of hydrogen that can be equivalent to more than actually equivalent to total energy supply today globally, 5,000 megawatts. What does it mean? We have the resources, we have the commodities, but we don't tap the commodities. And community and government need to do what we call public-private partnership to harness this very important commodity. In conclusion, my dear brothers and sisters, unlocking more financial resources remain key to African energy. I know that is one of the parameter or the matrices at which we discussed. We don't have money, we don't have this, we don't have this. The excuses of we don't have is becoming too much in global South countries. And this is, I know my brother Sean has told us we don't need to complain so much. We need to provide solutions, and that's why we are here. So doubling the energy investment and looking at the approach of which our colleague from London was talking about, I allude to that, looking for investment that are public owned to spur the energy, unlocking the energy gap in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa is one of the priorities we need to consider. Global support is key, and also technology shift and capacity building is paramount. In Kenya, I think we are open to other countries who want to benchmark with us in terms of geothermal expertise and other innovation skills. We are learning a lot from South Africa context also, because of South Africa has a lot of literature compared to any other African countries. But we need, I was challenging my friends yesterday, like Trevor, we need to put this theory into practice and suitable practice. Thank you very much, my brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. I'm just mindful of the time, comrades. I will invite the discussion to the floor now, but I've noted that the time which was given to me, I don't want to face a disciplinary hearing outside. So with those words, comrades, I think let me invite the floor to kindly assist us, on the issue of the technologies. I've noted you, comrades. 1, I've noted 2, you will be 3, comrades. You'll be number 4, you'll be number 5. There is number 6 as well. I think let me take the first round, comrades, in that following fashion. It's up to number 6. Let me start with you, comrades.
Thanks, comrades. Firstly, from my side, I want to applaud the whole panel and also the organizers for including this important aspect in what we discuss here. One of the biggest criticisms of us as unions about these issues is that we are opposed to renewables. And it's important for us to show that we are not opposed to renewables at all. In fact, we must embrace them. So thank you very much. I think the kind of statistics you gave us, the clear evidence that you are really deepening your knowledge on it, comrade from NUMSA. It's clear that you know your subject. It's appreciated very much by us. Comrades, then also the important thing I wanted to add to what Comrade Dr. Ali said is yesterday we spoke about the issues of trade-off. If you analyze renewables currently, one of the biggest issues with renewables for us as trade unions is the potential jobs bloodbath that it will cause, especially my union, AMCU. Our head office is in Witbank, in Malahleni, the place of coal, and we feel it. Our members feel it, and they are scared, very, very much scared of what will happen. And for that reason, we must analyze how can we embrace renewables. We can't run away from them. And one of the ways to do that is through a proper trade policy with other countries, whereby we can have a trade-off, as our one comrade yesterday, comrade across from me, was saying, let's trade minerals for skills. Let's say, yes, China, we will sell you coal, we will sell you platinum, we will sell you palladium, we will sell you lithium even, but you come back here, don't export to us the finished materials. Come here, let's beneficiate them together. You show us how to build solar panels. You show us how to build wind turbines, that we can build them ourselves, and at least we can maintain them ourselves. That is our big problem, comrades. And secondly, an important thing is where our government is falling short, big time, is on the issue of research funding. We need to fund research of universities. You know, during COVID-19, my wife works at UJ, mechanical engineering. And during COVID, there was this idea of funding for building respirators, you know, to assist with oxygen. And you should have seen the students all over the country. The students rushed at the opportunity. UCT, WITS, UJ, Potch, Stellenbosch, all of them. It was almost like a competition. And they were almost ready to produce our own respirators, but our country insisted on importing them. So we've got a problem of political will, but we also have a problem of corruption, comrades. Let's be honest, because obviously somebody in government has a very individualized, focused, interest-based financial interest in not doing that. So in summary, comrades, we need, Comrade Ali, I fully agree with you. We need to build our own capacity to utilize renewables. We don't have to rely on anybody to use renewables. Thank you.
Thank you so much, comrade. Number 2.
Hi, everyone. I work for Women. We're a Pan-African organization working with women impacted by mega extractive industries. So I just wanted to raise a couple of questions. I think as we're thinking about the energy transition, we need to be reimagining development for our countries. So a lot of energy, electricity that's generated across the continent is actually used by big industries, large-scale mines, and corporations. So you literally have examples where you have a coal mine and you have the power lines cutting across, moving over the community that's carrying all the costs of the coal. So I think we really have to ask some tough questions. What do we need electricity for in our context, and who benefits? And that takes us to a range of scales of electricity. And obviously we need green energy as far as possible, but we need to look at a wide scale, because if you think of farmers, which is the reality in most of our contexts, the majority of our population across the region are still farmers. What do farmers need to improve their lives? What do rural people need? And so I think when we think about a just transition, let us think about a new vision of development for our continent. And I think the question of debt is something that I think we really need to return to as unions and as movements. Our countries on this continent are heavily indebted. A lot of the debt that our countries are carrying is colonial debt, the debt of slavery, and in the South African context, we have apartheid debt that our government is still settling. So when South Africa was liberated in 1994, South Africa sat with $11 billion, actually pounds, 11 billion pounds. That was apartheid debt, which our government continues to settle. So I think if we're talking about finance, let us think quite cleverly around how this transition is financed. Because if we're going to the markets or we're going to the World Bank, they've got their own perspective, they've got their own agenda. We need to think creatively around how we liberate finance in a just sense to support energy and other transitions that are needed in our societies. And that requires that we are working together with other movements and organizations around the debt question. Let us do debt audits and identify the debts that are odious and illegitimate, and basically demand that those debts be that be cancelled so our countries could actually use the finance that is liberated to support our transitions. And the same is true now, where we're seeing the climate debt. We still have slavery debts. We have debts related to extractivism. So I think this is something I'd love to put on the agenda of this meeting as well, is where does the finance come from and how do we liberate our countries from the debt that we are currently sitting with? I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, comrade. Number 3.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to applaud the panelists for this education. My concern goes to Dr. Ali. We see that Kenya is making a significant milestone in the technologies. And I think Ghana, we adopted this mobile money system from Kenya. But the key thing here is how we achieving this. What is the extent of trade-off in terms of bringing on board private sector involvement? Because I'm informed that the country has established a ministry responsible for privatization. I stand to be corrected. Somebody told me in a meeting in Nigeria that the person is a Kenyan. So I think I could be right from that perspective. So I'm asking this because if you are going more private in terms of these technologies, then the concern is what is the effect of this on the employment levels in Kenya, the quality of employment and the rights of workers in the country? Because such technologies are envisaged to be just. That's what we expect. But if it's leaving some people behind and making others worse off, then we can't term it as just. So I want to see how this achievement is affecting the people of Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, comrades. Number 4.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. There was some very, very informative presentations. Is Brian still with us also? Hi,
yes,
Brian.
of course, come. Yes, of course.
All right. So, I mean, in your slide, in one of the slides on geothermal, you showed that especially in the Mpumalanga, the north of South Africa, Mpumalanga, Limpopo region, there is a high potential for geothermal energy in South Africa. And I'm wondering why we never talk of geothermal. It's not even in the IRP of 2019. There is no geothermal, and we can see or hear of the success from Dr. Ali of geothermal energy in Kenya. So I'm just wondering why we are not utilizing or exploring geothermal as another source of energy for South Africa. And also just to ask Dr. Ali if geothermal is a labor-intensive technology, because I think, considering that North Mpumalanga and Limpopo, where most of our coal-fired power stations are, that could be a source. And like Christo said, there's a fear that people are going to lose jobs. And if there is this potential for geothermal energy in those regions, why are we not talking about geothermal as a form of economic diversification in those regions? Thanks.
Thanks, comrade. Number 5.
Merci, camarades. Je rejoins mes camarades pour remercier vraiment les panélistes pour les brillantes présentations qu'ils ont eu à faire. C'est de dire, bon, certes, il y a un développement de technologies, des options énergétiques donc, à faire pour l'Afrique. Nous avons pris connaissance dans certains pays, certaines expériences qui sont parties vraiment à une vitesse de croisière. Et certes, nous devrons avoir un regard sur le développement économique de l'Afrique parce que nous sommes allés dans un système industriel galopant, mais sachant que ce système industriel est-ce qu'elle est propre à l'Afrique? C'est-à-dire que c'est une transformation. Et certes, nous parlons de l'énergie, le développement de l'énergie, l'accès à l'énergie, la transition juste. Et de l'autre côté, on parle donc de l'industrialisation de l'Afrique. L'industrialisation de l'Afrique, elle est faite par qui? Est-ce qu'elle est faite par les Africains eux-mêmes? C'est aussi des transferts, c'est une transformation, c'est une mutation qu'on est en train de faire. OK, mais l'industrialisation ne vous appartient pas. Ça appartient à la Banque mondiale, ça appartient aux capitalistes. Donc, c'est comme si on n'a rien fait. Et vraiment, un regard sur qu'est-ce qui est comme potentiel de développement économique de l'Afrique. C'est les secteurs sociaux de base. C'est l'agriculture, c'est l'éducation. Il y a un de mes prédécesseurs qui a parlé des fermes agricoles. Et aujourd'hui, la FAO a démontré que le millénaire prochain, en tout cas le développement agricole, c'est l'Afrique, le regard est sur l'Afrique et aussi les autres pays du Sud. Les potentialités sont là, mais malheureusement ne sont pas développées. Et on observe? C'est les multinationales qui viennent prendre les terres agricoles. Nous sommes dans un système où nous développons la bureaucratie, l'industrialisation, et tout le monde va. Donc, c'est nos populations des zones rurales donc, convergent vers les zones urbaines, et malheureusement, les infrastructures ne vont pas, ne peuvent pas aller de pair. Donc, nous avons constaté une démographie galopante donc, dans les grands centres urbains au détriment des zones rurales, qui sont des zones de production et qui alimentent aussi ces zones urbaines. Donc, le développement de technologies devrait aussi avoir, nous devrons avoir un regard aussi pour une transition juste envers le milieu rural. Parce que c'est comme si nous avons une locomotive. OK, une locomotive développée, les technotrains TGV, où la locomotive part et laisse les wagons derrière. C'est à ça qu'il faut faire très attention. Les potentialités existent, donc c'est d'utiliser, dans quel que soit le milieu rural africain ou bien les pays du Sud, les potentialités existent quand même pour développer ces énergies et vraiment être à la portée de nos populations. La question a été posée certes hier, mais nous pensons que quel que soit le milieu rural qu'il y a un développement, il y a une potentialité qui est là énergétique et qu'on pouvait développer et vraiment faire le développement donc, de l'Afrique. Sa base, c'est le milieu rural. C'est l'éducation, c'est la santé. Aujourd'hui, où vous allez vous déplacer, des femmes, des enfants, surtout les zones les plus vulnérables, les femmes, les enfants, qui ont le système de santé, comment on est dans le milieu rural, il est très, très bas. La couverture sanitaire, elle est très basse. C'est parce qu'il manque quelque part des systèmes d'énergie qu'on devrait avoir donc, au niveau de ces structures. Donc, les structures sociales de base doivent être développées tout en tenant compte aussi donc, du développement de cette énergie. Quand on prend les États-Unis, se sont développés, quand vous prenez les années, le 17e, le 18e siècle, leur base, c'est parti par l'agriculture. Et quand un pays n'est pas autosuffisant sur le plan alimentaire, quand nous sommes dépendants des importations sur le plan alimentaire, agroalimentaire, effectivement, il va de soi que quel que soit ce que nous allons développer, serait vraiment toujours sous les jougs de la Banque mondiale et du FMI. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Comrade. Comrade Trevor, number 6.
Thank you, leadership. I just wanted to ask a few questions in relation to what would have been presented by our comrade from Cape Town. The first one is, I see there when you were presenting that there's a great improvement in the use of renewables. Now, in addition to the question asked by my brother from Ghana, about the trade-offs insofar as ownership is concerned, I would like to ask, what were the trade-offs insofar as the protection of communities and workers in that particular transition? Because I would assume that at a particular point, what would have dominated were fossil fuels. But in that transition, which led you to eventually operate on the basis of higher renewable energy, what happened to those workers and communities which lived on the value chain of the fossil fuels? What happened to the mine workers? What happened to the workers at the power stations where you were generating electricity via fossil fuels? Because I think that experience will also assist us, those who are still to embark on such particular process, to know what we should be on the lookout for. Just like India is now currently using the 3 examples of the JED IPs to begin to position itself proper and negotiate better. So I think if you were to share such a lesson, it would also enable us to be able to do that. That's the first one. The second one is just generally, I don't know who can assist in answering, but generally on the decommissioning. So the debate around decommissioning of power stations, which we also differ with, is centered mostly around the question of those who are for fossil fuels, vehemently pro-coal. They are saying that you can't leave the fossil fuels underground. They are God-given, we must explore them. That's the first point. But there are those like us who agree that there should be renewables. There should be a transition. But where all of us, I think, converge in terms of our concern is around the question of decommissioning. And why is it convergence at that particular point? It is because there is an issue around the so-called base load. And we have seen, for instance, with Germany, because of the problems they've experienced running back to coal and all of that. So have we found any technologies in terms of renewables that can be able to resolve the question of the base load? If not, if we then go ahead with such particular kinds of decommissioning, what will happen to us when the natural, because we are not in charge of weather and as such, what will happen in future when the weathers are not favorable and we cannot be able to generate electricity from those other forms of renewables? So I would like to get a question, an answer, an assistance on that particular question. Ramaphosa was answering questions in Parliament, and he answered Ujuju. He said to Juju, we have Julius Malema. Sorry, comrades, I forget that. So it's just a leader of an opposition party. With the renewable technologies. Lastly, on the question of that, that is very close to my heart. And when we reinforce the issues around public debt, highly indebted, because for me, a country, South Africa as an example, even Kenya as an example, you see, the monetary regimes globally are very different. You have countries which are monetary sovereigns. And countries which are monetary sovereigns will be countries that issue their own currencies, that levy taxes in their own currencies, and quite often have higher debt that is denominated in their currency. And that does not present real debt problems. Now, the second element or category of the monetary regimes is those which have pegged their own currencies to other commodities like your gold, your silver, and others. But there is another element of the monetary regime this will be those currencies or countries that have given up the use of their currencies, like the countries in the Eurozone and Zimbabwe, for instance. They would have given up their currencies and began to circulate various currencies in their own countries. Now, that facing these countries is not different, and our analysis on it should not be wondrous, as though the problems of debt really matter much, especially the context of South Africa. The South African Reserve Bank bulletin shows that we have a foreign debt of 167 billion. Now, of that foreign debt, 83.1% of it is domestically denominated, which means it is denominated in the South African rand. The amount of money of that particular debt that we have to be concerned about is that which is not denominated in the South African currency, because we do not issue that. So if you do not issue that particular currency, you have the possibilities of defaulting in the future. But you can never default on a debt that is denominated in your own currency. But in addition to this, and to make matters worse, is that the South African Reserve Bank itself holds about 30 billion of the US treasuries, which means part of the domestic debt itself is not even a debt, because Treasury and the South African Bank are the two institutions of government, and therefore government cannot owe itself. So I'm worried because World Bank and the IMF, whenever they say we must bring private investments, they base their arguments on the fallacy and the myth that we are highly indebted. And when we take on such particular narratives, I'm afraid we're falling into that trap, and eventually we'll have to begin to ask, should we increase more debt tax? Should we go and borrow? Because if we labor under the myth that the issuance of bonds actually amounts to debt, then the problem will arise that you've got to go and borrow or tax people in order to increase to fund certain spending obligations, either on infrastructure or social provision. So I had that comment and I thought, no, we've got to push back on that question, because we have to push back even against the World Bank. That is the premise for privatization. We should not allow that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Comrade Trevor. Comrades, I'm just mindful of the time. I will have noted a lot of questions were directed to Dr. Ali. I'm going to give him at least a few minutes to respond to some of the questions. Comrade Mariana as well, if you could assist, then I will sum it up. Thanks, Comrade.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think there are four to five things that I need to respond to, but I'll give two of them to my senior colleague, the GS Kitau, Ernest Nadome, Kenya. The issue of M-Pesa technology, trade-offs, and privatization commission authority of Kenya, which I can affirm it's existing. Trevor, about the trade-off for how you protected employees as much as you transited to green energy, I will also give to my colleague. I will only respond to two. One is a comment from my brother from Senegal and one from my brother here. First, I want to respond to the issue of geothermal. And you said that Kenya is a successful country in terms of exploration of geothermal. I want you to tell you that the fact is that geothermal is labor intensive and cost intensive. But at the end, the cost that is passed to the end user at the generation is quite significant, very low. When we talk about the Kenya case, Kenya geothermal is selling 0.003 USD per kilowatt, compared to geothermal, which is selling 27 to 50 something, depending on the PPA that was negotiated. So it is quite labor intensive and it's quite cost intensive, but ultimately the best affordable to the citizens. And I want to tell you, for you to smell the roses, you must put up with the thorns. Okay, the other thing that I want to talk about is funding technology. My brother from Senegal also talked about. In Kenya, what we do is the government is quite interested in funding technology. And they do it through the vocational training centers, where they say they will provide the money for tuition and upkeep for students who are in vocational training center. It is good that Africa have taken up education so far. We have doctors, we have professors, we have graduates from universities who have not made any contribution to the society. But if you look at the baseline survey of who is more important to the industry, the local industry, are the vocational training centers. The people that will harness technology. We're not saying that the graduates and the masters and the doctors are not doing anything, but that is the baseline of it. And then I want to also remind my colleague about a change of attitude in Africa is very good. And if you look at the countries that have grown through a positive attitude, I want to give you an example of the peninsula, the Asian countries, the Arabian countries, peninsula. And more critically, I want to give you Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. In 1975, I think Senegal was there, Kenya was there, South Africa was so vibrant, Ghana more vibrant than any other country. In 1975, Saudi Arabia was being given charity by an Eastern African country. They didn't have money, only the desert. Somalia, who is the most unstable country in Eastern Africa, was maintaining the holy cities of 1975. That is a fact, you can find it. Today, you can see what is there in United Arab Emirates. They have ensured they traded off their minerals with capacity building. People who are running the infrastructure in Arabian countries, 75% are local people. They have taken their people to skill change program. They owned it. They had harnessed it to their home. And this is what we can do it. We can own our own skills and we can prosper the transition to a positive. We need to look at the long term. Sometimes we can be looking at the short term and we lose the focus. But if we look at the long term, we will not miss it. Let's do it for the next generation. And that's why Sheen and me will not be there. Sean and me will not be there in the next maybe 5 or 7 or 10 years. God forbid, Sean, I'm just saying, just for an insight, that let's do it. The transition is not for us. The transition is for those who are behind us. We are the initiators of transition, and we need to applaud it. Lastly, Madam Chair, it's not that we are doing transition only in the energy sector. We are doing transition in several sectors. And I like how my sister was talking about financial structure and transition to green economy and green lending. As much as a very good question she asked about where did we get the money to ensure that successful transition takes place. And I think that has been answered mostly by our discussion yesterday, but I will give to my brother to respond to those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. I will give it to Comrade Gias.
Yeah. I will also try, in the interest of time, to respond very fast. The colleague from Ghana asked about whether in Kenya we have a ministry charged with privatization. It's not there. It's not there. It's just a department within Ministry of Treasury. Secondly, the issue of M-Pesa, the mobile money in Kenya. I want to say this has been a game changer. Game changer in uplifting the lives of many Kenyans. And as we speak, this particular company, I know you brought in the aspect of whether it's completely privatized. No. The organization is called Safaricom. Safaricom is 40% government owned, and the other shares are listed in the stock exchange. This particular Safaricom company, I think, is the biggest, the largest in Eastern Central Africa in terms of revenue, and even in the contribution to GDP, I think is the best. Safaricom has enabled 80% of Kenyans to own phones, more than 80%. And then household, 96% of households own phones because of the convenience of the phones. We've gone as far as, and I'm sure in other countries also, you use the phone to get to reach out to the bank. You don't need to walk to the bank. You're able to get loan facilities.
and many, many other benefits that you get out of it. So generally, I would say it's been a game changer. They've employed thousands and thousands of agents all over the country. Yeah, so that is it. Then the issue of geothermal, as Dr. earlier said, it is labor intensive. I mean, it's both capital and labor intensive. But at the end of it, you'll be smiling all the way to the bank in terms of maintenance is easier. And the drilling, there's an aspect of drilling. When you're drilling, you require a lot of workers. And maybe to respond to my colleague, whether the entry of renewable, the entry of geothermal it costed us or employees lost. No. You see what happened? We had a shortage of electricity in the country. So when we started experiencing problems of drought, serious shortage in the earlier 2000, that is when now the government said, no, we need to diversify our source of electricity. And that is when the government now embarked on harnessing this particular resource, geothermal. So ideally, we got more employees, more people were employed. The local community where this particular geothermal, and I think this was ably represented by Brian, that sometimes the disadvantage is that you've got to occupy a lot of land and all that. The government came up with a deliberate effort to come up with a CSR for those particular communities. They have employed them, they have built hospital. So really, it has also been quite positive for them. So the issue of whether there are people who are doing fossil fuel, no. In our case, when it comes to renewable, it is purely public employees, because the company like KenGen now, which does geothermal, is the one that also does hydro. So ideally, hydro, and that's what we talked of, 80% of Kenyan power comes from renewable. So it's only a few. The employees who are now in the fossil fuel space are those who are working in IPPs, independent power producers, and they are equally our members. We are also representing them. That is the irony, but it's our duty to do that. So I think, Dr. I don't know that I've answered everything. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, comrade. Just to sum it up, I'm just mindful of the time. Yes. Thanks, comrade. I think just to sum it up, comrades, there was something which was raised by Trevor about South Africa decommissioning their coal power stations. And as such, there's been a narrative that renewables can replace, the fossil fuels. I think the question, quite frankly, is answered by the South African system operator, which is bestowed with the ultimate accountability and authority to manage the system reliably and securely and in a safely manner. And in their most recent report, they say variable generation output can only reduce the shortfall if the degree of their production coincide with the shortfall. And they go further to say there are instances where variable generation, which is the renewables, the production is low. And they go as far as to say, in some instances, this is non-existent for weeks. So they said, in this instance, you need a firm generation capacity to plug the gap. So basically, to use an experience, I think a lived experience, Germany, the Federal Network Agency, they would have established a Coal Exit Act that limited the two types of coal to 15,000 megawatts. But they were faced with the challenge of ensuring reliable electricity supply. Germany didn't think twice. They tapped on their reserves in their coal generation in order to ensure that the people, they've got electricity because the cost of not having electricity far surpasses the cost of whether this one is costing so much. And they went as far as to break their commitment on their greenhouse emissions in light of the challenges, you know, that they were accounting. So I think the discussion about the technology really goes to what has been raised by that comrade, is to say, what are you producing the electricity for? And if the consumers needs electricity 24/7, the options that are there, when you evaluate the cost, the emissions, and also the issue of reliability, certainly nuclear cannot be left behind, especially in our attempt, you know, to reduce our greenhouse emissions. And also other technologies, I think, such as carbon capture and storage, which is not matured yet, but if you look at history of coal power stations in South Africa in the 1950s was the first country to master the pulverized coal. To an extent, it exported that skill. Equally, other countries are doing so. So the issue of being short-sighted about technologies will tend to hamstring us in a way, because when you talk about these technologies, you need to look at long-term. Currently, there were talks of stuff in Quebec nuclear power station where some of them were being stolen by the UAE because South Africa was not committing on building any other nuclear power station. So you need to balance, you know, the interest of ensuring that the jobs, you preserve the job, you balance the interest of ensuring that the price of electricity is cheap, because currently, just to make an example, there is a wide outcry about NESA granting 19% tariff increase and 13% tariff increase. And there's not a single analysis to check what constitutes, you know, a huge percentage on those tariff increase. And when you dig further, 40% of the tariff increase for financial year 2025, it is because of the private sector. And you won't hear that being spoken to anywhere. Equally, a huge percentage of the 18% or 19% comes from the IPPs, because the narrative that has been planted is that they are cheap. They are cheap from a level of the contract, but they build on top of the consumer price, to which most of us are not going to afford, because if you consider the balance, if they are supposed to meet the demand, South Africa will have to have 3 or 4 times the demand, which is 32,000. And that is going to come at a cost to which none of us can afford, especially being carried by the private sector. So we need to think carefully about the technologies, but what is important is to reclaim these technologies to be in the public hands. Thanks, comrades.